The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Denver International Airport as travelers hurried in every direction. Gate 47 buzzed with the usual chaos of people checking phones and dragging suitcases and buying last-minute snacks from nearby shops. The flight to Los Angeles was boarding in 15 minutes, and passengers lined up along the carpeted walkway with boarding passes clutched in their hands. An elderly man walked slowly toward the gate counter, with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His leather jacket looked worn and comfortable, like an old friend he had carried through countless years. His face showed deep lines that spoke of a life fully lived, and his gray hair was neatly combed back from his forehead. He moved with the careful steps of someone whose body had logged many miles, but his eyes remained sharp and alert as they took in the busy terminal around him. The gate agent was a young woman named Claire Stevens who had been working for the airline for just under 2 years. She smiled professionally as the elderly man approached and held out his boarding pass. Claire took it and scanned the barcode and watched her computer screen light up with his information. Henry Morrison was the name on the ticket, and he was booked in seat 12A for the flight that would depart at 3:30. Claire glanced at the identification he placed on the counter next to his boarding pass. She picked up the passport and opened it to check the photo against the man standing before her. The face matched perfectly, but something else caught her attention. She looked at the expiration date printed on the page, and her smile faded slightly. The passport had expired 3 months earlier in July. Henry noticed the change in her expression and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had driven through the night from his small cabin in the mountains and had slept more than a few hours in the past 2 days. The urgency to reach Los Angeles had consumed every thought, and he hadn't even considered checking his documents. Before leaving home, Claire looked up at him with genuine sympathy in her eyes, but her voice remained firm and professional. She explained that airline policy did not allow passengers to board with expired identification, and that she could not let him proceed to the aircraft. Henry tried to speak calmly and told her that he needed to be on this flight because someone important was waiting for him. He asked if there was any way to make an exception, just this once because he had driven so far and the matter was urgent. The young gate agent shook her head and said she understood his situation, but her hands were tied by federal regulations and company rules. She suggested he could try to get an emergency passport from a federal office downtown, but Henry knew that process would take days he did not have. Other passengers in line behind him began shifting impatiently and checking their watches and whispering to each other about the delay. Claire picked up her phone and called for her supervisor while Henry stood there feeling the weight of 40 years suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. He had flown through enemy fire and navigated impossible odds and survived things that would have broken other men, but now a simple expired document was stopping him from keeping the most important promise he had made in decades. Man in his mid-40s appeared from a side door marked employees only and walked briskly toward the counter. Greg Palmer was the shift supervisor, and he carried himself with the confident air of someone who dealt with passenger problems every day. Claire quickly explained the situation and showed him the expired passport, and Greg examined it carefully before looking at Henry with a practiced expression of polite regret. Greg told Henry that he truly wished he could help, but the regulations were clear, and there were no exceptions permitted. He offered to help Henry rebook on a flight the next day if he could get his passport renewed overnight, but Henry knew that would be too late. The conversation at the counter grew more tense, and more passengers began to notice what was happening. A businessman in an expensive suit named Paul Henderson stepped out of line and complained loudly about the delay. He announced to everyone nearby that he had an important meeting in Los Angeles and could not afford to miss his flight because of one old man with paperwork problems. A mother traveling with 2 children, named Lisa Martinez, tried to keep her kids quiet while they tugged at her sleeves and asked when they would board the plane. Henry remained quiet through it all and simply held on to the strap of his duffel bag with both hands. His weathered fingers gripped the fabric tightly and his jaw was set in a hard line, but his eyes showed a deep sadness that went beyond this moment. Greg Palmer pulled out his radio and called for airport security to come assist with the situation, and Claire continued typing on her computer, trying to find any loophole in the system that might help. The crowd around Gate 47 grew larger as word spread that something unusual was happening. Some passengers stood on tiptoes to see over the heads of others, and several people pulled out their phones to record video of the scene. The noise level in the gate area rose as conversations multiplied and speculation spread about who the elderly man was and why he was causing such a fuss. In the corner of the waiting area, a young man in military uniform had been sitting quietly reading a book. Danny Cooper wore the dress uniform of the United States Marine Corps, and his chest displayed several ribbons from his service overseas. He had been on leave visiting family in Colorado and was heading back to his base in California. The commotion at the gate counter pulled his attention away from his book, and he looked up to see what was causing the disturbance. Danny stood slowly and walked closer to get a better view. He studied the elderly man at the counter with growing curiosity, and something about the face seemed familiar, though he could not immediately place where he had seen it before. The security personnel were making their way through the crowded terminal and would arrive at Gate 47 within minutes. Henry Morrison stood alone facing Greg Palmer and Claire Stevens, while dozens of impatient travelers waited behind him, and the clock ticked steadily toward departure time. The situation at Gate 47 continued to deteriorate as more passengers pressed forward trying to understand why boarding had stalled. Greg Palmer stood firm in his position and explained once more to Henry that without valid identification, there was simply no way to allow him on the aircraft. The supervisor's voice carried across the waiting area, and other travelers picked up bits and pieces of the conversation about an expired passport and federal regulations and impossible exceptions. Paul Henderson grew more agitated with each passing minute, and his complaints became louder and more pointed. He addressed the crowd around him rather than the gate agents and declared that one person should not be allowed to hold up an entire flight full of people with legitimate business to conduct. Several other passengers nodded in agreement and voiced their own frustrations about tight connections and important appointments. Waiting in Los Angeles, Lisa Martinez juggled her 2 children while trying to keep one eye on the unfolding drama at the counter. Her daughter Emma kept asking why everyone was upset, and her son Jake complained that he was hungry and wanted to get on the plane. Lisa quietly shushed them and promised they would board soon, but her own anxiety was rising as she watched the clock and calculated whether they would make their connection in Los Angeles. Henry Morrison remained remarkably calm despite the growing hostility from the crowd behind him. He had faced far worse than angry travelers and harsh words during his long life. His voice stayed low and steady as he tried one more time to explain to Greg Palmer why this particular flight mattered so much. He mentioned a friend in the hospital and a promise made long ago and the fact that time was running out. Greg listened with visible sympathy but shook his head and said his hands were tied. Claire Stevens continued working at her computer terminal and making phone calls to various departments within the airline. She spoke rapidly into her headset and typed commands into her system, and searched through policy manuals trying to find any provision that might apply to this unusual situation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard and her eyes scanned page after page of regulations, but nothing she found offered a solution. 2 security officers appeared at the edge of the gate area and began making their way through the crowd. They wore the standard uniform of airport security, with badges clipped to their belts and radios crackling with periodic updates. The taller of the 2 officers was named Marcus Flynn, and his partner was a woman named Beth Coleman. They had responded to hundreds of gate disputes over the years and approached this one with practiced efficiency. Danny Cooper moved closer to the counter with his book still in one hand. Something about the elderly man continued to nag at his memory, and he studied the profile and the way Henry held himself and the distinctive shape of his jaw. Danny had always been good with faces, and especially with military history. He had spent countless hours studying the great conflicts and battles and the people who shaped those events. The pieces suddenly clicked into place in Danny's mind, and his eyes widened with recognition. He took several quick steps forward and positioned himself where he could see Henry's face more clearly. The resemblance to the old photographs was unmistakable despite the decades that had passed. Danny felt his heart begin to race and his mouth went dry as he realized who was standing at the gate counter being turned away by airline employees. Greg Palmer noticed the security officers approaching and waved them over. He began to brief them on the situation while gesturing toward Henry and the expired passport still sitting on the counter. Marcus Flynn nodded as he listened, and then turned to address Henry directly. His tone was polite but firm as he explained that they would need to escort Henry away from the gate area if he could not provide valid identification. The crowd pressed closer and phones appeared everywhere, recording the confrontation from multiple angles. Several passengers uploaded videos to social media in real time, and within minutes the scene at Gate 47 was being watched by people far beyond the Denver airport. Comments and reactions began pouring in from viewers who had no context for what they were watching, but felt compelled to weigh in anyway. Henry looked at the security officers and at Greg Palmer and at Claire Stevens, who was still frantically typing at her computer. He saw the crowd of impatient passengers behind him and heard Paul Henderson's continued complaints about delays and missed meetings. For a moment, Henry considered just walking away and driving back to his cabin in the mountains and letting the world continue without him. He had spent so many years in quiet isolation, and part of him wondered if he should have stayed there. But then he thought about Jack Sullivan lying in a hospital bed in Los Angeles, waiting for his old friend to arrive. They had flown together through the worst days humanity had ever known, and had watched friends die and had somehow survived when the odds said they should not have. Jack had reached out after all these years of silence and asked for one final visit, and Henry had promised to come. Breaking that promise felt worse than anything the crowd or the airline or the security officers could do to him. Danny Cooper made his decision in that instant and stepped forward into the small, cleared space around the gate counter. His military uniform drew immediate attention, and several people stopped their conversations to watch what would happen next. Danny came to attention and addressed Henry directly in a clear voice that carried across the gate area. He asked a simple question that would change everything. He asked if Henry was Colonel Henry Morrison, and he pronounced the name with the respect due to someone of significant rank. The elderly man turned to look at the young Marine with surprise evident on his weathered face. Henry had not been called Colonel in many years, and hearing the title spoken aloud in this crowded airport terminal felt strange and disorienting. Henry nodded slowly and confirmed his identity with a quiet yes. Danny straightened even more, and his voice grew stronger as he spoke to the crowd. He identified himself as Sergeant Danny Cooper of the United States Marine Corps and stated that he had studied military history extensively throughout his career. What he said next made people stop talking and lower their phones and pay attention in a way they had not before. Danny explained that the man standing before them was not just some random elderly passenger with paperwork problems. Henry Morrison was a decorated veteran of the First Contact War and one of the most important figures in human military history. The crowd fell silent as Danny continued speaking, and even Paul Henderson stopped complaining to listen. Claire Stevens looked up from her computer with wide eyes, and Greg Palmer's expression shifted from bureaucratic firmness to something approaching shock. Henry Morrison's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack as Patricia Lewis stood before him with tears streaming down her face. He remembered her now from all those years ago when she had been a young pilot fresh out of training. She had flown wing position during some of the worst battles and had somehow survived when so many others did not. Seeing her here as a successful professional decades after the war stirred memories he had worked hard to keep buried. Other people in the crowd began to recognize the significance of the moment, and phones that had been recording now lowered as travelers realized they were witnessing something that deserved respect rather than social media content. The noise level in the terminal dropped further, and the usual airport announcements seemed to fade into the background. Gate 47 had become a small island of history in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Patricia stepped back after a moment and composed herself as best she could. She asked Henry the question that everyone was now wondering. She wanted to know why he was trying to board this particular flight, and why it mattered so much that he had attempted to travel with expired identification. Her tone was gentle but curious, and Henry could see genuine concern in her eyes. Henry was silent for several long seconds as he struggled with how much to reveal. He had spent 40 years avoiding these kinds of conversations and explaining himself to strangers. But something about the moment and the people gathered around him made him feel that perhaps he owed them an explanation. He took a deep breath and began to speak in a voice that was quiet, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. He told them about his wingman from the war whose name was Jack Sullivan. Jack had flown beside Henry through countless missions and had been there at the Battle of Luna and Mars Station, and every other desperate engagement where human forces faced impossible odds. They had developed the kind of bond that only combat creates, where each man trusted the other with his life every single day. Jack had saved Henry's life at least 3 times during the war, and Henry had returned the favor just as often. When the peace treaty was signed, and the Space Defense Force began to demobilize, both men struggled with returning to normal life. They had seen too much death and witnessed too much destruction, and carried too many memories of friends who never came home. Henry retreated to a cabin in the Colorado mountains while Jack settled somewhere in California. They exchanged a few letters in the first year after the war, but the correspondence gradually faded as both men tried to build new lives. Henry explained that he had not spoken to Jack in nearly 35 years. The war had left wounds in both of them that proved too painful to discuss even with each other. They had parted as friends, but the weight of shared trauma made it easier to avoid contact than to confront what they had experienced together. Henry knew this was cowardly, but he also knew he was not strong enough to face those memories while they remained so raw. 3 days ago, according to Henry, he received a phone call from a hospital in Los Angeles. A nurse explained that Jack Sullivan was in their care and had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Jack had perhaps a week left, according to the doctors, and he had used what strength he had to ask the hospital staff to locate Henry Morrison. Jack wanted to see his old friend one final time before the end. Henry had immediately agreed and promised to come as quickly as possible. He had thrown some clothes in his duffel bag and climbed into his truck, and driven through the night from his mountain cabin. He had not slept more than a few hours because every minute felt precious now that time was finally running out. In his haste and exhaustion, he had completely forgotten to check whether his passport was still valid. The elderly man's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. He said that he and Jack had spent decades avoiding each other because facing their shared past felt too difficult. They had wasted years that could have been spent as friends because they were both afraid of the pain that memories would bring. Now at the very end, Jack had reached out one final time, and Henry was determined not to let paperwork or bureaucracy stop him from keeping this one last promise. He told the crowd that Jack deserved better than to die alone after everything he had done for Earth and for humanity. Jack had been a hero just like thousands of others who flew converted cargo ships against alien warships. Most of those heroes were forgotten now or remembered only as statistics in history books. Jack Sullivan deserved to have his friend beside him at the end, and Henry intended to be there no matter what obstacles stood in his way. The silence in the terminal grew even more profound as Henry finished speaking. Several people in the crowd were openly crying now, and others looked away to hide their own emotion. Paul Henderson stood with his head bowed, and his earlier impatience completely forgotten. Lisa Martinez held her children close and whispered that they were learning something important about what truly mattered in life. Claire Stevens had stopped typing on her computer and was wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Greg Palmer looked visibly shaken and kept glancing between Henry and the expired passport still sitting on the counter. The security officers Marcus Flynn and Beth Coleman stood at attention with expressions of deep respect, replacing their earlier official demeanor. Danny Cooper spoke up again and addressed Greg Palmer directly. The young Marine pointed out that they were not dealing with a random passenger trying to circumvent airline policy. This was a man who had literally saved humanity and who was asking for help to fulfill one final obligation to a fellow veteran. Danny suggested that surely there must be some way to make this work given the extraordinary circumstances. Patricia Lewis joined her voice to Danny's and looked at the airline supervisor with an intensity born of personal experience. She reminded Greg that there were times when following the letter of every rule became less important than doing what was right. She said that Colonel Morrison had earned more consideration than most people would receive in 10 lifetimes, and that turning him away now would be a failure of basic human decency. Other voices in the crowd began to add their support, and suddenly the mood shifted entirely. Where moments before there had been impatience and complaints, now there was unity and determination to find a solution. Paul Henderson pulled out his phone and announced that he owned a charter airline company. He began making calls to see if he could arrange private transportation for Henry if the commercial flight remained impossible. Lisa Martinez started coordinating with other passengers to spread the word throughout the terminal. She wanted more people to know what was happening and to add their voices to the growing call for help. Within minutes, travelers from other gates began walking toward Gate 47 to see what the commotion was about, and word spread rapidly through the entire terminal that something extraordinary was taking place. Danny Cooper's voice carried through the suddenly quiet terminal as he began to explain who Henry Morrison really was. The young Marine spoke with the confidence of someone who had memorized these stories and studied these events until they became part of his own understanding of what it meant to serve. He told the assembled crowd about the year 2025, when massive alien ships appeared in orbit around Earth without warning or any previous contact. The ships belonged, to a race that humanity would come to call the Krator, and they had traveled across vast distances of space to reach the small blue planet. Their first communication was a demand for immediate and total surrender of all human governments and military forces. When Earth's leaders refused and tried to negotiate, the Krator responded with orbital bombardment of major cities. Millions of people died in the first 3 days of attacks, and humanity faced the very real possibility of extinction. Earth's military forces were completely unprepared for combat in space, and the few satellites and experimental spacecraft available were no match for Krator technology. Governments around the world issued desperate calls for anyone with flight experience to volunteer for a hastily organized space defense force. Scientists and engineers worked around the clock to convert cargo ships and mining vessels and anything else that could reach orbit into makeshift combat spacecraft. Henry Morrison had been 39 years old at the time and flying commercial routes for a major airline. He had previous military experience from his younger days, but had left active service years earlier to support his family. When the call went out for pilots, Henry volunteered despite being told he was too old, and despite knowing he might never return home. The newly formed Space Defense Force was in no position to be selective and accepted him along with hundreds of other civilian pilots. Danny explained that most of the volunteers had minimal training and were given crash courses in operating the converted spacecraft. The vessels themselves were barely suitable for combat, with makeshift weapons bolted onto cargo haulers and passenger ships. The Krator possessed superior technology in numbers and tactical experience, and every engagement resulted in heavy human casualties. Earth was losing the war and everyone knew it. The Battle of Luna changed everything according to Danny's account. The Krator sent a massive battle group to destroy Earth's lunar colonies and cut off access to crucial mining and manufacturing facilities. Henry Morrison led a squadron of 12 converted cargo haulers against a Krator force 5 times their size. Every military analyst expected complete annihilation of the human forces within minutes of engagement, but Henry had spent 20 years flying commercial aircraft through storms and mechanical failures and every kind of emergency imaginable. He understood how to read his environment and exploit advantages that others might miss. He used the moon itself as cover and positioned his squadron in ways that forced the Krator ships to spread out. He coordinated attacks that targeted specific systems rather than trying to destroy the heavily armored vessels outright. The tactics worked in ways that shocked both sides of the conflict. Henry's squadron destroyed 3 Krator cruisers and damaged several others before the alien battle group retreated. The victory bought Earth precious time to build more ships and train more pilots and develop better weapons. More importantly, it proved that human ingenuity and adaptability could overcome superior technology when applied correctly. Danny told the crowd that footage of Henry's maneuvers became required viewing for every Space Force pilot. Military academies around the world still taught something called the Morrison maneuver, which used gravity wells and debris fields to defeat larger opponents. The technique had been refined and improved over the decades, but the core principles came from that desperate battle near the moon 40 years ago. Henry Morrison went on to fight in dozens more engagements during the 3-year war. According to Danny, he rose through the ranks despite having no formal military academy training and became one of the most respected tactical minds in the space defense force. Other pilots flew with him because they knew his leadership gave them the best chance of survival. Crews volunteered for his squadron, even though the missions were invariably dangerous and the casualties remained high throughout the war. The conflict finally ended with a negotiated peace when both sides grew exhausted from years of brutal combat. The Krator had underestimated humanity's capacity for innovation and resistance and had suffered losses they never anticipated. Earth had paid an enormous price in lives and resources, but had proven it could defend itself. An uneasy peace settled over the solar system with clear boundaries established and trade relationships slowly developing. Danny paused in his narrative and looked directly at Henry before continuing. He explained that after the war ended, Colonel Morrison disappeared from public life almost immediately. He refused multiple medals and honors and declined every interview request and speaking invitation. Most of the detailed accounts of his wartime service came from other pilots and military historians, rather than from Henry himself. The general assumption among military communities was that Colonel Morrison had died years ago because no one had seen or heard from him in decades. The crowd at Gate 47 stood in complete silence as they absorbed this information. Paul Henderson's face had gone pale, and his earlier complaints seemed to have evaporated entirely. Lisa Martinez held her children close and whispered to them that they were witnessing something important. Claire Stevens and Greg Palmer stared at Henry with new understanding of who they had been turning away. The security officers Marcus Flynn and Beth Coleman had stopped their approach and now stood respectfully at a distance. Henry himself looked uncomfortable. With the attention and the public revelation of his past, he had spent so many years avoiding exactly this kind of recognition, and had built a quiet life far from cities and crowds, and anyone who might remember his face from old war footage. His jaw tightened and his hands gripped his duffel bag more firmly, but he did not deny anything Danny had said. An older woman pushed through the crowd toward the front and her eyes were filled with tears. She wore a business suit and carried an expensive briefcase, but her professional composure crumbled as she approached Henry. Her name was Patricia Lewis, and she addressed him as Colonel Morrison before executing a crisp military salute. Her voice shook with emotion as she identified herself as a former Space Force officer who had served under his command. Patricia told the assembled crowd that Henry Morrison had saved her life twice during the war. The first time was at the Battle of Luna when his tactical decisions protected her damaged ship long enough for repairs. The second time was at Mars Station, when a Crador ambush threatened to overrun the human position, and Henry's counterattack broke the enemy assault. She said that every person in her unit owed their survival to the man standing before them. What happened next demonstrated something fundamental about human nature that had made Earth's defense possible 40 years earlier. When faced with a problem that mattered, ordinary people from all walks of life could unite with remarkable speed and creativity. The same quality that had driven civilian pilots to volunteer for certain death now drove strangers in an airport terminal to help an elderly veteran reach his dying friend. Paul Henderson finished one phone call and immediately began another. His charter company had 2 aircraft currently at Denver, but both were scheduled for other clients. He started negotiating with those clients to reschedule their flights and offering generous compensation for the inconvenience. One client agreed immediately upon hearing the circumstances, and the other needed only a brief explanation before also consenting to the change. Lisa Martinez had pulled up social media on her phone and was coordinating with several other passengers to spread Henry's story across multiple platforms. A young man named Chris Baker, who worked in digital marketing, offered to help craft the message for maximum impact. Within minutes, the hashtag Veteran Needs Help began trending locally and then spreading to national audiences as people shared the story. News reporter named Kevin James had been waiting at a different gate for his own flight when he heard about what was happening at Gate 47. He grabbed his equipment and rushed over to document the scene. Kevin had covered countless human interest stories during his career, but recognized immediately that this was something special. He began streaming live video with narration that provided context for viewers. Tuning in from around the country, Greg Palmer was on his phone with Airline headquarters explaining the situation to increasingly senior executives. The customer service supervisor had escalated to the regional manager, who had escalated to the vice president of operations. Greg described Henry Morrison's military background and the circumstances of his travel and the growing crowd of supporters gathering at the gate. He stressed that the situation required immediate attention from the highest levels of the company. Claire Stevens continued working every angle she could think of from her position behind the counter. She had contacted the Transportation Security Administration to inquire about emergency exceptions to identification requirements. She had reached out to the State Department to ask about expedited passport processing. She had even called the Federal Aviation Administration to see if they had any authority over the situation, Each call led to more bureaucratic dead ends, but she refused to give up. The airport manager, Susan Wright, arrived at Gate 47 after receiving urgent messages from multiple staff members. She was a woman in her late 50s who had worked in aviation for 3 decades and had seen nearly everything that could happen in an airport. But the scene before her was unlike anything in her previous experience. Hundreds of travelers had gathered around the gate, and the atmosphere felt charged with emotion and purpose rather than the usual impatient frustration. Susan quickly assessed the situation and began making her own phone calls. She contacted the TSA supervisor, Carl Henderson, who was the senior federal official on duty at the airport that day. She explained the circumstances and stressed that they needed his physical presence at Gate 47 to evaluate options. Carl agreed to come immediately after hearing Susan's description of what was happening. Patricia Lewis had taken it upon herself to provide more details about Henry's military service to the growing crowd. She spoke about specific battles and tactical innovations and the countless lives that had been saved by his leadership. Her voice carried authority because she had been there and witnessed these events firsthand. Other veterans in the terminal began to identify themselves and share their own stories of how the war had touched their lives. A man named Roy Bennett, who had fought in a later conflict, stepped forward and saluted Henry. His son Peter, who was currently serving in the Space Force, stood beside his father in full dress uniform. They had both studied the Morrison maneuver during their training and never imagined they would meet the man who created it. Other military personnel scattered throughout the terminal began making their way to Gate 47 to pay their respects. The airline's chief executive officer was watching Kevin James's live stream from corporate headquarters in Chicago. She had been in meetings all afternoon, but someone on her staff had pulled her out to show her what was unfolding in Denver. The CEO, whose name was Monica Harper, immediately recognized the public relations implications, but more importantly felt genuine concern for the elderly veteran being turned away. She picked up her phone and called Greg Palmer directly. Monica authorized an immediate exception to the company's identification policy given the extraordinary circumstances. She told Greg to get Colonel Morrison on that aircraft by any means necessary, and to provide him with first-class seating and any other accommodation he needed. She also instructed the gate supervisor to issue a formal apology on behalf of the airline for the initial delay. Greg acknowledged the orders with visible relief and turned to share the news with Claire. But the TSA supervisor, Carl Henderson, had just arrived at Gate 47, and the situation required his approval as well. Federal transportation security regulations superseded airline policy, and Carl held the authority to stop Henry from boarding, regardless of what the airline wanted. The crowd watched anxiously as the federal official examined Henry's expired passport and listened to explanations from multiple people about who he was and why this flight mattered. Carl Henderson was a 30-year veteran of federal law enforcement who had worked airport security since the early days of the Transportation Security Administration. He understood rules and regulations, but he also understood that rules existed to serve people rather than the reverse. He stepped away from the counter to make several phone calls to his own superiors and to verify Henry's identity through military databases. The verification process took nearly 20 minutes, during which the tension at Gate 47 remained almost unbearable. Henry stood quietly throughout and seemed resigned to whatever decision would be made. He had done everything he could, and now the outcome rested in the hands of people he did not know. Patricia Lewis stayed close beside him, and Danny Cooper positioned himself nearby as well in a show of silent support. Finally, Carl Henderson returned to the counter and addressed Greg Palmer and Henry directly. He explained that he had verified Colonel Morrison's identity through multiple sources and had received approval from senior TSA officials for a one-time exception to identification requirements. The decision was based on the extraordinary nature of the circumstances and Henry's documented military service. Carl would personally document the exception and take full responsibility for the authorization. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers when Greg Palmer announced that Henry would be allowed to board the flight. Strangers hugged each other and several people openly wept with joy. Paul Henderson, who had been preparing his charter plane as a backup option, smiled broadly and shook hands with people around him. Lisa Martinez's children Emma and Jake asked their mother why everyone was so happy, and she tried to explain about promises and friendship and doing the right thing. Henry Morrison looked overwhelmed by the response and seemed unsure how to react to the celebration happening around him. He had spent so many years avoiding attention and living quietly that this public moment felt deeply uncomfortable, despite the positive outcome. Patricia Lewis gripped his shoulder firmly and told him that he had earned this support through decades of service that most people could never comprehend. Claire Stevens processed Henry's boarding pass with tears still visible on her cheeks. She upgraded him to first class using the authorization Monica Harper had provided and made sure his seat assignment was confirmed. She told Henry that the entire flight crew would be informed about who he was and that they would take excellent care of him during the journey to Los Angeles. The announcement that Henry Morrison would be allowed to board his flight triggered something that nobody at Denver International Airport had ever witnessed before. Kevin James's live stream had now reached several 100,000 viewers, and the story was being picked up by major news networks across the country. People throughout the terminal who had been following the updates on their phones began walking toward Gate 47 to see the resolution in person. Veterans from multiple generations and branches of service emerged from various corners of the airport. Some wore military uniforms because they were traveling on official orders, while others dressed in civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who had served. They came because word had spread that one of the great heroes of the First Contact War was present, and they wanted to pay their respects to a man who represented something larger than himself. Roy Bennett and his son Peter were among the first to form what became an impromptu honor guard near the gate entrance. They stood at attention with perfect military posture and saluted as other veterans joined them. A woman named Karen Phillips, who had served in the Space Force during the Second Contact War of the 2040s, took position beside them. A man named Victor Hayes, who had been a Marine during peacetime, positioned himself in the line as well because he understood the significance of the moment. More veterans continued to arrive, and the honor guard grew to include dozens of people. They formed two lines, creating a pathway from the gate counter to the jetway entrance. Some were young and recently separated from service, while others showed the gray hair and weathered faces of those who had served decades ago. They represented Army and Navy and Air Force and Marines and Space Force and Coast Guard because this moment transcended individual branches. The thousands of ordinary travelers moving through Denver International Airport began to notice the unusual gathering at Gate 47. Business people rushing between flights slowed their pace and looked toward the crowd. Families with children stopped to see what was happening. Airport employees paused in their duties to watch. The word spread person to person and gate to gate that something extraordinary was taking place. Kevin James continued his live narration and explained to his growing audience what was unfolding. He described the honor guard forming in the crowd's gathering and provided background about Henry Morrison's role in Earth's defense. His camera captured the faces of veterans standing at attention and the reactions of regular travelers who were learning about history they had not known or had forgotten. Patricia Lewis spoke briefly to the assembled crowd and asked for a moment of respect as Colonel Morrison prepared to board his flight. Her voice carried through the gate area, and people immediately began to quiet down, the conversations and phone calls and all. The usual airport noise began to fade as the message spread outward from Gate 47 through the entire terminal. The silence grew in concentric circles, moving away from the gate like ripples on still water. Travelers at nearby gates stopped talking and turned to see what was happening. People on moving walkways stepped off and stood still. Passengers in the food court set down their meals and moved toward the windows that overlooked the concourse. Airport announcements continued over the public address system, but somehow they seemed muted and less intrusive than normal. Within 5 minutes, the massive terminal had fallen into a hush that was almost eerie in its completeness. Thousands of people stood quietly and watched Gate 47, where an elderly man in a worn leather jacket prepared to board a flight to Los Angeles. The moment felt sacred in a way that transcended religion or politics or any of the usual divisions that separated people. This was simply human beings recognizing sacrifice and service and the better angels of their collective nature. Henry Morrison stood at the gate counter with his boarding pass in hand and looked out at the sea of faces watching him. He saw veterans standing at attention and ordinary travelers holding their children and airport workers who had abandoned their posts to witness this moment. The weight of their attention pressed down on him, and he felt the same reluctance to accept recognition that had driven him into isolation for so many years. But he also saw something else in their faces. He saw genuine respect and gratitude and a desire to acknowledge what he and thousands of others had done during humanity's darkest hours. These people were not trying to make him uncomfortable or force him into some role he did not want. They simply wanted to say thank you in the only way they could manage in this impromptu gathering. Patricia Lewis stood beside Henry and placed her hand on his shoulder. She leaned close and spoke quietly so only he could hear. She told him that these people needed this moment as much as he needed to reach Jack Sullivan. They needed to believe that heroism was real, and that sacrifice mattered, and that the ordinary person could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. By accepting their recognition with grace, he was giving them something valuable, even if it felt uncomfortable for him. Henry nodded slowly and took a deep breath. He straightened his shoulders and picked up his duffel bag and prepared to walk through the honor guard toward his aircraft. Greg Palmer stepped aside from the counter, and Claire Stevens smiled at him with genuine warmth. Carl Henderson from the TSA stood respectfully nearby and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Danny Cooper maintained his position of attention near the front of the honor guard line. The elderly man began walking toward the jetway, and the silence in the terminal somehow deepened even further. His footsteps on the carpet seemed loud in the absence of other sound. The two lines of veterans held their salutes as he passed between them. Henry returned each salute with the practiced precision of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times during his military career. Travelers throughout the terminal stood in absolute silence and watched his slow progress. Parents held their children and pointed toward the gate while whispering explanations about history and courage, and the man walking toward his plane. Teenagers who normally could not look up from their phones stood transfixed by the scene. Business executives who measured time and money and efficiency found themselves frozen in place. Kevin James captured every moment on his camera, and his live stream audience had now topped 1 million viewers. The major news networks had begun broadcasting his feed directly because their own reporters could not reach the scene quickly enough. Messages flooded social media from around the world as people watched an elderly veteran receive the recognition he had avoided for 4 decades. Henry reached the entrance to the jetway and paused to look back at the terminal one final time. He saw Patricia Lewis standing near the gate counter with tears streaming down her face. He saw Danny Cooper maintaining his salute with unwavering precision. He saw Roy Bennett and Peter and Karen Phillips and Victor Hayes and dozens of other veterans holding their positions of respect. Beyond them, he saw the thousands of ordinary travelers who had stopped their busy lives to witness this moment. He raised his hand in a final salute to the assembled crowd and held it for several long seconds. The gesture was simple, but carried the weight of shared history and mutual respect and acknowledgement that these people had given him something he had not expected. Then he turned and walked down the jetway toward the aircraft that would carry him to Los Angeles. And the friend who was waiting for him there, the silence held for another 30 seconds after Henry disappeared from view. Then slowly and quietly people began to move again. The veterans lowered their salutes and some embraced each other, while others simply stood together in quiet companionship. Ordinary travelers wiped tears from their eyes and picked up their bags and resumed their journeys. The terminal gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed in a way that was difficult to define but impossible to deny. A hospital representative waited for Henry at the arrival gate, holding a sign with his name printed clearly. The woman introduced herself as Sharon Moore and explained that the hospital staff had seen the news coverage from Denver and wanted to ensure Henry reached his friend without any further delays. She led him through the terminal to a courtesy vehicle that would transport them directly to the medical center where Jack Sullivan lay in palliative care. The drive through Los Angeles traffic took 40 minutes, and Henry spent the time staring out the window at the sprawling city that had changed so much since his last visit decades ago. Sharon made polite conversation and mentioned that many hospital employees were veterans or had family members who served. The entire staff felt honored to facilitate this reunion between two men who had fought for humanity's survival. Henry thanked her quietly, but his mind was already in the hospital room preparing for a conversation he had avoided for 35 years. They arrived at a modern medical facility. In the late afternoon, with golden sunlight slanting across the building's glass facade, Sharon escorted Henry through security and up to the palliative care unit on the 7th floor. The nurses at the station recognized him immediately from the viral videos and social media posts that had circulated throughout the day. They greeted him with warm respect and pointed toward a room at the end of the corridor where Jack Sullivan waited. Henry walked slowly down the hallway with his duffel bag gripping his shoulder, and his heart pounding in a way it had not during combat. He had faced enemy warships and impossible odds and the constant threat of death in the vacuum of space. But this moment of reconnection with his oldest friend terrified him in ways that battle never had. He reached the door marked 714 and paused to gather himself before knocking gently and pushing it open. Jack Sullivan lay in the hospital bed looking far more frail than Henry remembered. The man who had flown fearless combat missions now appeared diminished by illness and age and the relentless progression of cancer. But his eyes remained sharp and alert, and they focused immediately on Henry standing in the doorway. A smile broke across Jack's gaunt face, and he raised one thin hand in greeting. Henry crossed the room and took Jack's hand in both of his own. Neither man spoke for several long moments as they simply looked at each other and absorbed the reality of being together after so many years. The silence held no awkwardness because they had shared too much history for words to be necessary. Finally, Jack squeezed Henry's hand weakly and said he had worried his old friend might not make it in time. Henry assured him that nothing in the universe could have stopped him from keeping this promise. They spent the first hour catching up on the broad strokes of their separate lives. Jack had settled in Los Angeles after the war and worked as a flight instructor at a small airport. He had married and raised 3 children and found satisfaction in teaching young pilots even though he never discussed his military service with students. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, and his children were scattered across the country with careers and families of their own. He had lived a good life overall, but admitted that something had always felt incomplete because of the friendship he had abandoned. Henry shared his own story of retreat and isolation in the Colorado mountains. He described the peace he had found in nature and solitude, but also acknowledged the cost of cutting himself off from other people. He had convinced himself that isolation was necessary to deal with his memories, but now recognized it had been partially cowardice. Facing the past with someone who understood felt impossible, so he had simply avoided it entirely. Both men acknowledged their shared failure to maintain contact and agreed that fear, rather than animosity, had kept them apart. The conversation gradually shifted to the war and the memories they had both tried to bury. Jack talked about specific missions and fallen comrades and the constant terror that preceded every launch into combat. Henry shared his own recollections, and they discovered that each man had carried different details of the same events. By combining their memories, they reconstructed moments that neither had fully understood at the time. The process felt cathartic as they finally gave voice to experiences that had shaped every day of the 4 decades since. Jack asked Henry whether he had found peace with what they had done during the war. Henry considered the question carefully before responding. He said that he had made decisions that resulted in deaths of both enemy combatants and fellow humans, and that those deaths weighed on him regardless of military necessity. He could rationalize his choices as proper tactical responses, but rationalization did not erase the faces he remembered, or the voices that sometimes woke him at night. Peace felt like too strong a word, but he had achieved a kind of acceptance that allowed him to function. Jack nodded in understanding and said he felt much the same. He talked about the alien pilots they had killed and wondered if those beings had families waiting for them to return home. The crater had been aggressors, and their demands had left humanity no choice but to fight. But individuals on both sides were following orders and trying to survive and probably questioning the larger decisions that had led to war. Jack said he hoped that wherever those alien pilots ended up after death, they found more peace than he had managed during life. The 2 old friends sat together through the evening as nurses checked on Jack periodically and provided medication to manage his pain. Henry held his friend's hand and they continued talking about everything and nothing. They laughed about foolish things they had done as young men and shed tears for friends who never got the chance to grow old. They discussed the families they had raised and the quiet lives they had built after the chaos ended. They acknowledged their failures and forgave each other for decades of silence. Jack grew more tired as the evening progressed and his words came more slowly. He told Henry that calling him here had been important because he needed his friend to know something. He said that during the worst moments of the war, when survival seemed impossible and death felt certain, Knowing that Henry led their squadron had made the fear bearable. Jack had trusted Henry completely, and that trust had allowed him to fly into situations that would have paralyzed him otherwise. He wanted Henry to understand that his leadership had given Jack the courage to survive and to eventually build a good life. Henry felt tears streaming down his face as he listened. He told Jack that the same had been true in reverse, and that knowing his wingman would be there had sustained him through his own darkest moments. They had kept each other alive through mutual trust and respect, and shared determination not to let the other down. That bond had mattered more than tactics or technology, and had been fundamental to their survival. Henry thanked Jack for being the best friend and brother-in-arms that any person could hope to find. Jack squeezed Henry's hand one final time and said he was glad they had this chance to say things that should have been said years earlier. He closed his eyes and smiled peacefully, and told Henry not to waste any more years hiding from the world. Too many good people had died during the war for the survivors to throw away the lives they had been given. Jack made Henry promise to stay connected with Patricia Lewis and Danny Cooper, and the others who had helped him reach Los Angeles. He insisted that Henry had something valuable to offer the next generation, and that isolation served no one. Henry promised he would try and would honor Jack's memory by opening himself to connection again. Jack seemed satisfied with that answer and drifted into sleep. Henry sat beside the bed through the night, holding his friend's hand and listening to the steady rhythm of breathing. The nurses checked on them regularly, but left the two old warriors mostly alone together. They understood that some moments transcended medical care and required only presence and companionship. Jack Sullivan passed away peacefully in the early morning hours with Henry at his bedside. His breathing simply slowed and then stopped, and the room fell into a profound silence. Henry sat for a long time afterward, still holding the hand of the friend he had finally found again, only to lose forever. But he felt no regret for having made the journey, because keeping this promise had mattered more than anything else he could have done. Jack had died knowing he was not alone, and that his sacrifices were remembered and valued by the person who understood them best. The funeral took place 3 days later and was attended by Jack's children and grandchildren and a surprising number of other veterans who had learned of his passing through news coverage and social media. Henry met Jack's family and shared stories about their father's courage and skill and loyalty. The children thanked Henry for coming to be with their father at the end, and said it had brought their dad peace to reconnect with his old friend. Henry promised to stay in touch with them and to share more stories when the grief was less raw. 6 months passed and brought changes to Henry's life that he had not anticipated. He remained in contact with Patricia Lewis, who visited his cabin in Colorado, and convinced him to install internet service so they could video chat regularly. Danny Cooper called every Tuesday afternoon, and they talked about military history and current events and life in general. Laura Chen followed up on her invitation, and Henry Morrison settled into his first-class seat and placed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment. The upgrade felt excessive, but he understood it was meant as a gesture of respect rather than luxury. Other passengers filed past him toward their seats in the rear cabin, and several paused to nod or offer quiet words of thanks. Henry accepted their acknowledgement with simple grace while wishing the attention would fade so he could be alone. With his thoughts about the reunion waiting in Los Angeles, the cockpit door opened and a man in a captain's uniform walked back through the first-class cabin. Captain Andrew Miller was in his early 50s with graying hair and the confident demeanor of someone who had spent 30 years flying commercial aircraft. He stopped beside Henry's seat and introduced himself before explaining that the flight crew had been informed about their special passenger. Andrew asked if Henry would be willing to come forward and sit in the cockpit's jump seat for the flight. Henry immediately declined the offer and said he did not want any special treatment beyond what had already been provided. Andrew persisted gently and explained that it would be an honor for him and his co-pilot to have Colonel Morrison in the cockpit. The captain mentioned that he had studied aerospace engineering in college and had written papers about the tactics used during the First Contact War. Having Henry present during the flight would mean more than the airline executive could possibly express. A young woman appeared behind Andrew and introduced herself as Laura Chen, the flight's co-pilot. She was perhaps 30 years old with sharp eyes and an eager expression. Laura explained that she had attended the Space Force Academy and had written her senior thesis on the Morrison maneuver. She had analyzed the original battle footage and studied the physics and psychology behind Henry's tactical decisions. Meeting him in person felt surreal, and she added her voice to Andrew's invitation. Henry looked at the two pilots standing before him with such genuine enthusiasm, and found himself unable to refuse again. He agreed to sit in the jump seat if they truly wanted him there, and both Andrew and Laura smiled with obvious delight. They helped him gather his bag and led him forward through the galley, into the cockpit where a third seat was positioned behind and between the two pilot stations. The cockpit was far more advanced than anything Henry had flown during his airline career decades ago. Digital displays replaced analog gauges and computers, handled tasks that once required constant manual input. Andrew and Laura walked him through some of the changes and explained how modern commercial aviation had evolved. Henry listened with interest, but his mind kept drifting to Jack Sullivan and the hospital bed where his old friend lay waiting. The flight departed on time after the last passengers boarded and the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Andrew and Laura conducted their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, while maintaining a running conversation with Henry about his experiences during the war. They asked respectful questions about tactics and decision-making and the psychological challenges of combat in space. Henry answered honestly, but kept his responses brief because discussing those years remained difficult even after all this time. The aircraft lifted off from Denver and climbed toward cruising altitude while the Rocky Mountains spread out below like a vast rumpled carpet. Henry watched through the cockpit windows and remembered the countless times he had flown this same route during his commercial airline career. Those had been simple days focused on schedules and weather and getting passengers safely from one city to another. He had never imagined that quiet life would be interrupted by alien invasion and desperate combat and decisions that affected millions of lives. Laura asked about the Battle of Luna, and specifically about the moment when Henry decided to use the moon's gravity well as a tactical advantage. She wanted to understand his thought process and what made him see possibilities that other commanders had missed. Henry explained that years of flying through turbulence and storms had taught him to read his environment and find advantages in what others saw as obstacles. The moon was simply another environmental factor to be exploited, like wind shear or atmospheric pressure. Andrew listened intently, and then shared that he had served briefly in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. He had always wondered whether his civilian flying experience would translate to combat situations, or whether military training created fundamentally different decision-making patterns. Henry's presence in the cockpit represented a bridge between those worlds, and Andrew wanted to understand how that transition had worked. Henry found himself opening up more than he had in years as the conversation continued. Perhaps it was the familiar environment of a cockpit, or the genuine interest these two pilots showed, or simply the fact that he was finally heading toward closure with Jack. He talked about the fear that never went away no matter how many missions he flew, and the weight of knowing that every decision affected the lives of people under his command. He described the guilt that came from surviving when so many others did not, and the impossible task of finding meaning in loss on such a massive scale. Laura asked whether Henry had stayed in touch with other veterans after the war. He admitted that he had not, and explained his retreat to the mountains and the decades of isolation. He told them about Jack Sullivan and the phone call from the hospital, and the promise he was racing to keep. Both pilots listened quietly and seemed to understand that some wounds never fully healed even with the passage of time. The flight continued smoothly westward across Utah and into Nevada. The desert landscape below gradually gave way to the sprawling urban development of Southern California. Andrew and Laura handled their duties while maintaining the conversation, and Henry found the experience oddly therapeutic. He had spent so many years refusing to discuss the war that he had forgotten how much relief could come from sharing the burden with people who wanted to understand. As the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, Laura asked one final question. She wanted to know what advice Henry would give to young pilots who studied his tactics and tried to follow his example. Henry thought for a long moment before responding. He told her that tactics and maneuvers were less important than understanding that every person under your command deserved your absolute best effort. He said that leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes both good and bad, and never asking others to take risks you were unwilling to face yourself. Andrew added that those principles applied equally to commercial aviation and military service, and life in general. Henry nodded in agreement and said that the values he had carried into combat came from his civilian flying career and his upbringing, and the simple belief that people should take care of each other. The war had not created those values but had tested them in ways he never anticipated, and had proven that they mattered more than technology or firepower. The aircraft touched down at Los Angeles International Airport and taxied toward its assigned gate. Andrew and Laura thanked Henry repeatedly for sharing the flight with them and for the insights he had provided. They offered to help him make any connections he needed to reach the hospital, but Henry assured them he had transportation arranged. He gathered his duffel bag and prepared to disembark with the other passengers. As Henry stood to leave the cockpit, Laura stepped forward and handed him a small card with her contact information. She asked if he would be willing to speak at the Space Force Academy sometime in the future, because cadets needed to hear from someone who had lived through the experiences they studied in textbooks. Henry took the card and promised to consider the invitation, though he made no commitment. Some part of him recognized that perhaps isolation had run its course and that connecting with the next generation might offer a different kind of purpose. He walked through the first-class cabin and into the jetway, where bright California sunshine streamed through the windows. The flight attendants thanked him quietly as he passed, and several passengers in the terminal recognized him from the viral videos that had spread across social media during his flight. Henry nodded politely but kept moving toward the exit because only one thing mattered now: